Hey guys, welcome to another exciting video. In this video we'll be talking about layouts in CSS. By the end of this video you will have a deeper understanding that will help you to convert any kind of design, basically whether it's an image or whatever you think of, into practical websites. And we'll be covering a set of key concepts, basic properties from beginner level to advanced, in order to place your content in the web wherever and however you want. So without further delay, let's get started. So first things first, we will be talking about the box property or the box model in CSS. Now box model or box property is a property of every element present in CSS, every element that can be represented by an HTML tag, and it defines how the core CSS behaves. So for that I have created a simple HTML view here, and I'm just hosting that page at this side using live server extension, so that if I write something here, I put some content like this is some content. As soon as I save it, it will reflect here. Now we will start to understand the box model using a simple element called a div. Okay, so let's create a div and let's put some style to this div. So I'll create a simple style tag, style style tag, and here I will give this div a basic width of 100 pixels and then a height of 100 pixel, a padding of 20 pixels, a border of let's say 10 pixels solid DDD. Okay, and we will, to visualize this area, we will have a background of let's say hash AAA, and finally we will have some margin of let's say 20 pixels. Okay. Now three of the properties, that is the padding, the border and the margin, they can be extended with a dash, and then you can provide top or bottom or left or right to denote the individual sides of the property. But for now let's save this, and we will have something like this, a box in CSS, and this box will help us to understand what the box property or the box model denotes in CSS. So we'll right click here and we'll go to inspect this element, and we will switch to the element tag, element tab, which is already selected here, and we will use this arrow to select this element. Now as soon as we select this element, we can see that different colors of areas or regions are popping out in our view, and the styles of this element, they are loaded here in this style section. And if we scroll down, we can see that there are some boxes here which represents the box model of CSS element. Now every element, they have these kind of things which defines the element structure itself. The first things first is the this 100 by 100 area, this area which is defined by the width and the height, and here which is defined by this color, and which is called the content of the box. Whenever we put something here inside this div, let's say I am the content, it will appear inside this content area. Okay, if I hover over this, you can see that it starts inside the box from the top left corner of the box, and it's defined the content which is of size 100 by 100. After this content there exists padding, and which is here defined as the green color, and after that there is this border, and after that there is this margin. Every CSS element, it has these four properties. The content means the area where the every children of that HTML element will be present. The padding is something that separates the content from the border. It's like leaving white space inside the element, not outside but inside the element. Then comes the border, which defines the outskirt of the element, the outline which wraps around the element the name is auto suggestive border, and there is margin which separates the element from other elements, and this is what is typically known as CSS box model. Okay, now as I explained, the width and the height of the element defines by default the content area of the HTML. So the actual width of this element, including the padding and the border, will be 20 pixel plus 10 pixels at both sides after the content. So the content is 100 pixels, but the whole element, it will take 160 pixels as width, and the same goes for height, because this is a square element. But in many cases we want to define the width in terms of the whole area of the element, not the inside content, cause in most of the cases this content width is ambiguous, having the padding, and then also you are having the margin. So to define that thing, how a box should react, there is a property in CSS which is called box sizing, and this, it has four types of values. One is initial or inherit, which takes the parents data, how the parent behaves, the child will behave the same. But by default the value is set to content box. So if I save this, you can see that the box, the width and the height, they represent the content of the box in CSS. But if we want the width and the height to represent the border, we can simply say border box. And what it will do is, after I save this, you can see that the element shrank, and now the border is 10 pixels and the padding is 20 pixels, so 60 pixels in total in width or height, with border and padding. And so the content now is left with only 40 pixels, and the width of this element is exactly 100 pixels. So this covers the basic concept of box model in CSS. Now the padding and margin, they have different syntaxes for different scenarios. Like we can have two values here representing the top and bottom and the left and right, and we can also have four values here representing each direction simultaneously. You can google it out, or watch W3 School to have a complete understanding of padding and margin. I'm just giving you the concept of what padding and margin actually means. Now, having a basic understanding of the theoretical concept behind the box model, we can go into the next topic, that is the parent-child relationship. In HTML, every element is represented as a node to a tree. The whole document itself is a tree, as you can see here in the elements tab, and every section of that tree, it may or may not contain some children. So basically a div, this div here, it's a child to the body, and body, it's a child to the HTML tag. You can see here also the HTML tag, it has two children. One is the head, another is the body, and this body, it has one children, that is the div. And this parent child relationship, it can go to any level you want. Let's say we have a parent here, like let's call it a main is also an element present in HTML, and most of the elements, they are just same, there is nothing fancy about them, but just to have a different element I am using main. And now if I move this div inside main, we can see that here that our HTML, it has a child called body, and body, it has a child main, and it also has a child of script, which is appended due to the live server. But the main, it also has a child called div, and which is the child to main, and the main, it's the parent to the div. So the two terms that we have learned is, one is child and one is parent. Now there is one more thing to know, that is, let's say we have another div. Okay, so we can just copy and paste another div here, and I'm just going to change this to I am content 2. Okay, so now and this main tag, I'm just going to give it a color. So let's say we have a background of a different color, let's say tomato. And now we can see that our body, it has a child, if I hover over the body, the whole HTML that is visible inside our page is direct descendant to this body, and body has a child called main. This is our main, and if I expand main, then it has two children. One is this div and another is this div, and everyone they are maintaining their own box property accordingly. Like for main, if I see main here, you can see that main has this content area hole, but it has no padding, no border, and no margin. uh, Actually there is an default margin for every HTML page, so you can see this margin here, and by default the value is set to 8. Okay, so if you just want to omit the margin for the whole HTML, you can use an asterisk tag, which means for every element, and you can just say to margin is 0, so that no element will have margin except you want it to contain some margin. Okay, and this margin by the way, this margin here you can see it's due to this margin that has been added to this div. Okay, so if we look into this again, we have this main and it has two children, which are these two divs. But what's the relation between these two divs? The answer is simple. They are siblings. They are descendant of the same parent, so they're called siblings. Now let's talk about another very important property, a property that distinguishes between the positions of the elements inside a web page. And as you can guess, the name of the property is position. So before that, let me change the HTML a little bit. First of all, I would like to make this width and height a little bigger. So let's say it's 200 pixels here, not 100 pixels. Just let's save this, and for now let's remove this margin. Yeah, I'm not concerned about margin. And as you can see that these boxes, and they are placed one after another, and if I just close this here, you'll see that these boxes, they're placed one after another, and this is what it's meant by the normal positioning of the elements, or which is called statics. So if I just put here a property called position, and I set a value to static, what you will see is that nothing is changed here. But let's steer things up a little bit, and instead of static, let's use another very commonly used position, which is absolute. And as soon as I save this, you will see that everything has collapsed into one place. Now what has happened? I am content 2 is here, I am content 1 is missing, and what the hell is going on? So let's speak with the divs individually. So what I will say is, as divs are the direct descendants of, or the childs of the main, so I will say main, and then I will use this selector called nth child, which will select the nth child of the parent div. And in this case 1 will represent the first div, and 2 will represent the second div. So I will once again say main, and then nth child 2, and what I will do is I will give these the second div two distinct properties. One is called left, not margin or padding, but just only left, and I will give it a left like 20 pixels. Okay, and then I will give it a top, another distinct property, not margin top or padding top, but only top, and I will give it a top of, let's say 50 pixels. And as soon as I save that, you will see that it has moved from top about 50 pixels, and it has moved from left about let's say 30 pixels, 20 pixels. Okay, and the same thing what I can do is for the first child I will use another two properties. One is right, and for this time I will use 100 let's say 20 pixels from right, and also bottom opposite to the top, and we will give it obviously 50 pixels. And now let's save it. And you will suddenly think, what the hell is happening, what's going on? So let me explain what absolute does. Is absolute, it doesn't care about the parent child relationship in general, as long as the parent div is static, that is this main div. As every div, they have some different some default css properties, and in case of position, that is a static position. And what it has done is it has just ignored the position of main, and it has ignored the cascading of the style, that is from main the styles are decided, the padding and margins are decided, but rather it has just used these right and bottom and top and left in order to position the elements. Like here it has two constraints: the absolute constraint with the HTML page, that is its position is absolute, and this absolute position says for the first child is that it will be placed 20 pixels from the right and 50 pixels from the bottom. And as you can guess, the second element is also following the same kind of principles here. Now, one thing is that, let's say let's remove this from bottom and right, and we will see that the first element that was here is at the behind, and the second element which was here is at the front. So basically position absolute means absolutely position that element with respect to the page, with respect to the top of the page, as long as the parent of that element is static. Okay, that is the constant. And by the way, every element is by default statically positioned. Position static is the default value for every position. So now if I want to take this content, this first div on top of this second div, what I can do is just let me change the color here, it will make things easy. So I will give it this a different background, and this time I will use something like a little bit of red. So let's say FAA. So this is a little bit of pinkish color, and if I want to just put it on top of that element, what I will do is I will give it a Z index, and this time I will give it a value 2. So what happens is every element whenever they are positioned on top of each other, the Z index defines which element is going to be on the top and which element is going to be at the bottom. And Z index is a number. The higher the number, the chances of that element to be on the top is greater. So now that's okay, but let's give this main a little volume here. Let's give it a width of, let's say 500 pixels and a height of 500 pixels. And now we can say that this is the main div, but and this is right here. But what I want to do is I want to give this a little bit of margin, let's say 40 pixels. Okay, so it has some margin of 40 pixels from left, right, and also at the bottom and the top, but it's not visible. And now what I would like to do is I would like to change the position of the main, which is the parent of two absolute divs. So position to relative, and suddenly what has happened is this element and this element, they are positioned not with respect to the page but with respect to the main. So whenever a element is positioned absolute but its parent is positioned as relative, as main is the parent of the divs, what happens is the left and the right of that element and the top of the and the bottom of the element is calculated not with respect to the page but with respect to the element, that parent, which is at relative position. So this is how we can position an element with respect to other, and the same goes if these elements are relative. Okay, so if I say relative for both parent and child, what will happen is the first element, it will be positioned with relative to the parent, and the second element, it will be positioned with as a relative to the first element. So in this case, this one first element, it was positioned with relative to the parent, and as nothing was specified, it was just saying the top is 0, left is 0, so it was here. And then the second element, it was positioned relative to that first element, that first tip. And so what it did is it took the first tip and it took a 50 pixels top distance and 10 pixels right distance, and so it positioned it here. Now here this is a very cool trick to position something inside another thing using top and bottom, and how we can typically do a great thing, and how we can typically use these things to our advantage. Let me give you a quick example. So let's say the parent is a relative and the childs are absolute, and for some reason I want to position the element at exactly the middle of that parent, at exactly the middle of the parent. In this case I want to position the first element at the exactly middle. So what I will do is I will say that its left is 50%, as you can also use percentages instead of pixels, and its top it 50% is 50%. It doesn't matter if you can, if you want to use bottom and if you want to use bottom and right, it's also going to be same, but it will be positioned somewhere right here. Okay, yeah, where the second content is here. And as you can see that this top corner of this element is at exactly the middle of the parent, not the element but the top corner of the element, because we are just calculating this top and the right here. And if we calculated the bottom and the right, then this bottom corner, this corner, it will be at center. Okay, so for example, for the second element, what I want to do is I want to say the bottom of that element is 50% of the parent, and the left of the element is again 50% of the parent. And as soon as I do that, you can see that this point is also not left, but here I will use a right. Sorry, my mistake. As soon as I do that, you can see that the middle point is touched by the, for the second element, the middle point is touched by the bottom right point of that element, and with the first element the middle point is touched by the top left point of that element. So what if you want to just exactly center the element, what you need to do is you need to just translate it. So we will apply a transform to the first element, and what I will do, I will translate by minus 50% at top and minus 50% at bottom. Now translate uses these percentages with respect to the width of the element. So when I save it, it will exactly translate that element to the middle. And if I am just considering it as bottom, so I will just have to push it this width of the element right and the same width of the element down. So what I will do is, in this case the transform will be same 50% 50%, but the only difference is that it will be reversed. So instead of minus, it will be plus. It's a difficult concept to understand at the beginning, but as soon as you start understanding, so it's just on top of each other. If I give it a greater z index, so let's say I give z index of 3, so it will be on top. So they are now perfectly centered to this relative parent. And now if for some reason I think that the position of this relative is changed to absolute, okay, because we are here to try out, we will see that obviously nothing has changed here, because it's positioned with respect to this absolute element, and it goes same like whenever you are positioned with respect to relative, or whenever you are positioned with respect to absolute, the child element, if it's at absolute or relative, it will be absolute or relative with respect to the parent, not the page. So, but here the main is absolute with respect to page, so I will give it a left of 10 pixels to give you the benefit of doubt. So as you can see, its left is now at 10 pixels, and let's give a top of, let's say, 100 pixels. So now the element, this element, it's at an absolute position like this, and then this element is at a position absolute to this. Now this absolute to its parent. Now if I suddenly change it to the default value, that is static, I will just remove this. What will happen is these two children, they will just completely ignore its parent, and the it will be positioned with respect to the body or the predecessor or the parent of the parent, which has a relative or absolute value. So now in this case, this content, this box is perfectly centered with the page, with respect to the page here. So this is how you can center, or you can even put the element at right or left. I can just put the element at right by saying that the, now let's remove for the first child, let's remove this value, and it's here because I am, and just say that the right here, just remove these values first, and just let's say that it has a right. And now it's I'm doing this with respect to the body, because the main, it's no longer an absolute or relative element but a static positioned element, and I will say it's right to 0. And what it will do is it will push that element to the 0, to the absolute right, and I can say that bottom to 0, to push that element to the bottom. So this is how we can use absolute positioning and relative positioning to our advantage. Now there is one more positioning technique, but for that I need to put some content. So I will put a section here, and I will put some demi text using lorem, and I saved it. It will be appearing here, because this element is static, and static elements, they usually, what they do is they fall one after another. And as you can see, we are getting to that point where we are just designing that structure of the page. And what I will do for some demi text is I will copy this section here. Okay, I am using something called as an emit, something called as beam, in order to type. So I can use this kind of cool shortcuts. Okay, it's not like I'm cutting or paste, I'm pausing that video in middle. So I will just paste it a couple of times. Okay, it doesn't matter how it's organized, but as you can see, now the content, it overflows the page, and whenever I scroll down, this box, it doesn't stay with with respect to the screen, and it scrolls to the top. But let's say I want this box that is at the end of this page, to at the bottom of this page, to always stay at the same position with respect to the scrolling. So I don't want my scrolling or the position of the page, or if you want to speak in JavaScript terms, then the scroll x or the page x or scroll y, or the page y, to affect this element, and I want to put this element fix. So what I can do is I can use another kind of position. I can say for the, it's the first child of min. So what I will do is I will say now that this element has a position, not relative, not absolute, but just fixed. So fixed, fixed. And when I save this, now if I scroll, this element is fixed, the position of this element is absolutely fixed. Now some cases where you can use this is like the chat boxes which popped at the bottom of the Facebook a few months or years ago. They use this kind of fixed layout, or something like you have a header that you want to stick. So let's just give a quick example. So let's say we have a header, and its name is header. Okay, quite ambiguous. Let's have a h1 called header. And now we can say that here is this header, and I will give this header a little bit of CSS. So it's not that much. I will just give it a width of 100% and a padding of 20 pixels, and let's say a high background of let's say hash ddd. Okay, so a little bit of color. So as you can see, this is our header, and whenever we scroll, the header also scrolls. But if I want to just put the header at the same place, what I can do is I can simply just give it a position of fixed. So position fixed, and it will be fixed here. Okay, so whether I scroll like this or this, it will be position fixed here. Now the z index here is very important, because it's it's going to, if you want to put it at the top of every element, so I will give it a high z index. In many cases people just give it a high z index like 1000 to make sure that it stays on top of every element. And now there is a little bit of margin here which we want to understand what is, why it's here. And the best way is to inspect the element, obviously. So I will open the inspector and I will inspect this header in order to understand what's going on, why this header has this kind of weird margin. And as you can see in this header, it doesn't have a margin, it has a padding, and it has a position of 40, and that position of 40 is due to and now let's remove this by just setting left to 0 and top to 0, and that will make the header stick to the top. So as you can see, that now the position is set to 0, and it was set to 40 because CSS works as a cascading style script. So whenever the style is cascaded, the values that are set are transmitted to the other elements, what happened in case of header. And now you can see that our page, it has a beautiful header, and it's already looking quite like a website. Okay, but that's not our focus. So we have learned about various kinds of positions like fixed, absolute, or relative, in these three. And also the default one, static, we already know how it behaves. But there are other positions, if I put it here, like there is a sticky, and there are initial and inherit and unset. These three are quite common to every property of CSS, whether it's font size or anything. It just means that inherit means that whatever the parent has, whatever the parent is having, do the same. Or initial is whatever the default value is should be taken. Or unset is that whatever the value is, just set it to null. And null, by null I don't mean then value null, but whatever the null value means for that unit. Like for padding, it's the 0 means null, and stuff like that. So once again, we are going to start from an empty page. We'll create a quick boilerplate code to begin with here, and then it will be very simple. We will have a main element, and inside it we will have 3 divs. So div, and then 2 more divs, and then we will have some simple styles to these elements to begin with. So we will create a style tag, and first of all we will set the default styling, that is for every element the margin will be 0, and the box sizing will be border box. Next we will style the body a little bit so that the body stretches the whole screen. So we will say width is 100 viewport width, and height is 100 viewport height. And with that we will give it a little background of hash ddd, and we'll save. Now if we reload this page, we can see that our body, it has a little gray type color, and it's stretched in the whole screen. Now we will say set the parent container, that is main, and the style of the child containers inside. So what I will do is we will say main, and we will give it a border of 1 pixel solid black, and it will have a width of, let's say, 80%, and height of 80%, and we can see it here. Now we will just give it a little margin of, let's say, 10 pixels, so that it's a little bit apart from the sides. Okay, and this is how it looks. Let's collapse this here. So this is our main container here, not so special anything, just to separate this thing as a container, as a bordered. And now for the divs, the IV, we will give a width, the width of 150 pixels and height of 150 pixels, and a border of 1 pixel solid hash, let's say 999. Okay, a little grayish type background, and you can see that the divs, they're arranged like this. And whenever we use a div, the div has a display type of block, so instead of being placed one after another, it's placed to the bottom. The same thing goes for main. Some elements like a tag or anchor tag or span, they have the display property set to inline. We will get to display now, so don't worry. But before that, we will set the different colors for each grid. So that's like the previous, we will use the nth child, and for one we will have a background color of, let's say, background color, well, there are a lot of colors to choose. Let's say we will use coral as the first div's background. For the second one, we will use a background and here is one extra column that I need to avoid of, let's say, TL will be good. And for the third one, so main and child 3 will have a background color of, let's say, this one. I don't know what it spells, but it seems nice, so we will have this. Okay, so main nth child 3, and as you can see, we have these 3 divs to work with. And let's change this TL to a little bit like this color, just to suit the eye, nothing else. So now we have these things. We can work with different kind of displays. So the first display that we will be looking at is inline, and what it does, it makes everything inline. As you can see here, it's just in one line. You can just see this small block here, nothing else. I can write something inside this div, like div 1, div 2 and div 3. Okay, hopefully we will be looking at those divs here now, the contents. And the divs, in spite of having width, height mentioned, and they will just act as the only, they have content and nothing else. They don't have any padding or margin or border available to them, and that's because that's how inline works. It just makes the elements act as text blocks which are in one line. So after inline, the second display type that we will be looking at is already we know is blocks. So what blocks is blocks is how the divs are defined. Every block, they take a space, and they, after that, the next block, it will not be placed after that block, because in that case, so every block, it will take a vertical space, and it will not allow any other block to be besides it unless it's forced to do so. We will look at it into later. And other than that, they will just stick one after another in vertical order, and the default display of divs are blocked. Now there is also display none, which we can mention very quick, which will just make those things disappear from the screen. So if you want to disappear an element, you can use display none, obviously. And then display contents. Okay, so display contents will only show the contents as text, like inline, but the difference is that the inline had the border and the background available, but here you will only have the content displayed, nothing else, no other things like the width and height and the sizes. They will not be in displayed. There are different kinds of displays, like a list item, which is not applicable in case of divs, but in different cases it will happen. Like you have table display, like tables, or display like table captions and so on. These are separate display types that may be required in different cases. But the next display type that we will be looking at is inline block. And what inline block will do is it will make the things display inline just like previous one, but this time they will have their width and height, so they will be displayed one after another. So if we have like multiple divs, we can just paste some more divs here, and they will be displayed one after another, and whenever there is no space, it will be concatenated at the bottom. Okay, and we can have some more divs here to overflow this container. And this is the default thing happens when the amount of elements reaches the boundary and crosses the boundary of the parent element. And just quickly to demonstrate how to deal with these things, we can use a property called overflow. And the default of overflow lets everything be visible. So visible is the default, but we can set auto, which will give you a nice scroll bar whenever the content overflows. But if the content doesn't overflow, so let's say we have some contents deleted here, just like that, and then there will be no scroll bars. But you can also enforce the scroll bar if the overflow is set to, let's say, overflow is set to scroll. Okay, so there will be a scroll bar forced to, whether it needs or not. And there is also overflow hidden, which will apparently hide the divs that are not necessarily. So we will just copy and paste some divs again. As you can see, it whenever it flows out of the scope of the parent, they will be just hidden. Now you can also define the overflow type, like if you want the overflow to be hidden only in y-axis, so you can say that overflow y to be hidden, and that way only overflow y will be hidden if y is overflown. And if you set like overflow x is hidden, so only x-axis will be affected, but the y-axis it will be it will just get the auto type by default. So you can use overflow x or overflow y with respect to each other, how you want to prefer, but by default they usually act as overflow visible, that is they overflow from the container. Okay, so this was just a quick tips and tricks to how let's say avoid or hide excess elements. But we don't need excess elements, we just need our 3 divs, or this 1, 2 and 3, and we can study the layouting and the positioning of the divs by looking into the next type of our display. But this time we will not be applying display to our children, but rather we will apply the display to the parent, and this display type is called flex. So we will say display flex, flex, And what we will do is, you can see that they are just stack one after another. But to give you a quick review of what flex does, is flex creates a one-dimensional container. By default, if nothing is mentioned, it will act as a horizontal container. But if you say like flex direction, which will define the direction, so flex flex direction, and if I set it to, let's say, column, it will act as a vertical container. Now there are different kinds of directions available for a flex display, like column reverse, which will reverse the elements. So it will start from the ending, and the first element will be at bottom, then the second element, then the third element. That is reverse order of the normal column. This was the normal column, so the first element was there, then the second, then the third. And you can also use different kinds of elements. You can also do the same like row reverse, to put the first element at the end of the container and start from there, and it will act as a horizontal container. Okay, now the default value is row, so if I set row, you can see that this is like this. But flex can either go in horizontal way or go in vertical way, depending on the flex direction, and it's a property to the parent which defines how the children of that parent should be arranged, or whatever you can say, should be arranged. So now that we have our three elements displayed here, what I want to do is I want to give them a little gap. So I will say flex so now let's try to make these things at now let's explore the other possibilities of flex, because flex is a very powerful container that provides us almost all the capabilities that we need to design something at a particular direction. In this case, we are now defining these things as horizontal, because the direction is set to row. So the first thing that we will look at is justify content. It will decide how the contents are placed one after another. The default one is flex start, which will put everything at the start of the container, but you can also use flex end to put everything at the end of the container. But you can see that row reverse reversed the order of the elements, but here the order of the elements is same, but the items together, they're placed at the end of the container, because this is a row wise container, so it goes like this here instead of going here this way. Okay, and we can just simply change the width to mean width, okay, and height to mean height, and you can see that the flex, it will try to stretch the element to fill the whole container if there is no such constraint as this should be the height. So if the element can be stretched, then it will stretch the content to the whole container, which is 90 degree to the direction of the flex. Now important thing is that justify content, it acts according to the direction of the flex, but there is also something called as align item, which acts to the 90 degree of the direction. So if the flex direction is row, then align items will act towards the column, and if flex direction is column, then the align items will act as a row. So for now we will just set it to the default property, which is stretch. We can see that it has already stretched the elements, so we can keep it like this. And the next thing what we will do is we will look at other justify contents. So these are not the only one justify contents. A very popular one is center, which centers all the elements. No matter how the size of the div is, the parent is, it will perfectly center the elements. As this is a row, so it will the flex will act as a row, and it will center everything at as a row. But let's say if we change this to column, it will center everything in the column direction. And now the align item, that is stretch, is going to apply it at 90 degree, that is it will be now working at the horizontal axis. And let's just again change this to row. I'm just quickly showing these things to you, but as you explore these things by your own, you will have a better understanding. Now if I just want to keep things spaced evenly, then what we can do is we can use justify content, and we can set it to let's say space between. Okay, and it will give the items, it will put the items, and it will put some even space between the items. Now there is also space evenly, which will evenly space the items, putting the space at the both side and then the middle, and these spaces are there, they are just calculated dynamically. There is also a space around, so it will be a less space at both side, which is exactly half of the space that is at in the middle. So the half of the space of the middle, it will be allocated to the both side, and then it will have the space in between. Now these are the justify contents, most of the most important justify contents. There are some others like baseline, but it's not, I can't just show you every possibility right in a short video. So next let's go to align item, and as we know, align item, it acts at the 90-degree angle of the flex direction. So align item, it will act as row here. Okay, as our flex direction is row, our align item, it will act towards the column, so it will act as y-axis. So the first thing in the align item, its work is to align the items towards align the items that are justified in a certain manner. So the very common one is center, like, and we know what center does. Center just aligns everything at the center. That's what align item centers does. And let's just change justify content to center, and what it will do is it will just perfectly place everything at the middle, just like we used the absolute and then the transformations to center the elements. We can also use just flex display, and then we can justify the content center and align the item center to make everything at the center. Now the align item, we can set it to, let's say, flex start like previous one, and what it will do is it will push the elements to the top in case of the flex direction is row, and if the flex direction is column, so if the flex direction is like this, it will push everything to the left. Okay, because the starting, because it acts at the 90-degree angle of the direction, the align items. And the reverse will be happen if you use flex end, so it will push those things right in case of column, and in case of row it will push everything at the bottom. Okay, now we have already seen stretch. What stretch does, it just stretches the whole element to fit the container if possible. So we have this stretch option available, and we have seen center also, and there is also another, that is baseline, which apparently takes everything and puts them to the baseline. So in this case it will be acting as same as flex start. So if I just say that this is a column instead of row, it will act like this. Now you can try different kinds of combinations of justify content and align items to put everything at different places. Like if let's try to put everything in the four corners. So first let's try this flex start and flex start here to put everything in the left side, top left side, flex start and flex start. So everything is at top left side. Let's set this row, and if we want everything at the top right side, we will say flex end. So it's here. Now let's set this to flex end, so everything is at a bottom right side, and let's set this to flex start, so everything is bottom left side. So like this we can place everything inside a container in either horizontally or vertically, depending on the direction of the flex. It's a very powerful container that helps us doing these things, but for now let's just put everything at center. So we'll say center, justify content center, and we will align the items to center. Okay, now the individual divs, they can also have a property called flex whenever the parent div has a display of flex, and what it will do is it will help the thing to stretch. So if I say flex 1 to 1 div, what it will do is it will have the spaces allocated for the other elements, and the rest of the space will be covered by that element which has a flex 1. Okay, but it has another application which is let's say the second child has a flex of 1, and the third child also have a flex of 1. Now the 3 will have the same amount of span or width. It depends on the direction, because this is a row, so it's going this way. If it was a column, then it will have been done in different order, like this, and it will they all have the same kind of width and height. Now these are, you can think this as fractions, like how many part, this is taking one part, this is taking one part, and this is taking one part. Just like quickly save this. But let's say our first container, it will be twice the size of the other two containers, so I can say that set it to flex 2, and it will have the twice size of each container. So this times 2 is this, and this times 2 is this. Now let's say our first container is one fraction, second one is 2 fraction, and the third one is 3 fractions. So we can see the first one, its double size is allocated to the second one. Just let's minimum boundary, and let's set this to a very less value, like 50. This can be 150. So you can see that it's now have one fractional width, this now has 2 fractional width, double of this size, and this now has 3 fractional width, double of this size. So the both these containers takes the half, and this one takes the rest. So this is how we can set the flex values like so, and to create complex containers. There are limitless possibilities, and you can just align anything depending on different kinds of flex alignment to create a from simple to very complex layout. Okay, like if we have a header here, and if we have a footer here, let's say, like a typical site. Okay, and if we set the body, it has a display of flex, and the flex direction is column, flex direction is column. And if we have a header which has a background of, let's say, this color, let's change the color a little bit, which has a background, let's say, fire brick, and we have a footer which has a background of let's say anything like cyan. Okay, and if the header is like has a height of 50 pixels, like this. Okay, and if the footer here has a height of 300 pixels, like this, like a typical website, or 200 pixels, and we want the rest to be stretched by main. So what I can do is I can remove this margin here and width and height here, like this, and now I can set this to flex 1 to take the rest of the space, and we now have a perfect looking website like this. Even what we can do is we can just align items from center to stretch. So now we have a quite nice looking structure that can be a website. Like here is a panel, here is a panel, here is a panel, here is the header, and here is the footer. And you can think of this in many ways. Like you can again have some children inside these divs, and they will have their own children, and you can create any kind of complex structure like this. Now there are some other properties like flex wrap, flex grow on, or flex shrink, but these are a little bit advanced topics for this video, so I will just leave these things for a future video, where we will be looking at things like responsive sites, and how to make a site responsive for different screen width like mobile and desktop, so on. And there we will be discussing those kind of things and the advanced tricks that we can do with it. But this is a fairly good example of how display flex works. Now that we have a basic design of now that we have a basic understanding of how flex works, we can look at the from the next kind of display. Let me just quickly delete the unnecessary things here. So just give me a few seconds and I will be done. So I'll just remove this justify content and align items here, and also this header, footer, and these other values. So just a few minutes. And we can remove this footer and this header, and once again we are with our previous setup, except we want to make these divs 150 pixels and our main to have a width of 80% and a height of 80%. Okay, just like before, we have this mean width and mean height and everything is perfect. And let's remove this display flex. So we have our initial setup. Now let's have some more divs to work with. So we will just copy and paste a bunch of times. This is div 4, this is div 5, and this is div 6, and probably a little more, and this is div 7. I guess this should work. Okay, let's have another one just for my satisfaction. We will call this div 8. Okay, so we have these 8 divs. Now let's quickly have colors for these ones as well. So we will just quickly do some copy pasting. We'll change these indexes. Let's set this to 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. This one I don't need it. And let's just change the colors. So this one will be this one will be this, and this one will become pink, like so, and this one will be a little bit, let's say, like this. So now if we save this, we have some divs that are going outside our container, and we will once again change this minimum to only width and height. And we have these boxes. Now what if I don't want a container that is only designed in only one direction, either horizontal or vertical, but rather I want a container display type that will help us to arrange the child elements in a 2D way, because this surface is actually 2D and we want a way to achieve 2D stylization, 2D layout to place all the child elements. And for that there is a very powerful display type which acts as a 2D display, which is called grid. So for main we will have a display called grid, and as soon as I do that and save it, nothing happens. You can see here nothing happens because we haven't still defined how our grid should look. But let's say our grid, it will have 3 columns and every column will be of equal size. For that we can use a property called grid grid template columns to define the columns, and we'll use one fractions. F stands for fraction, just like we used flex 1, flex 2, flex 3. It's the same concept, one fraction and one fraction. And as soon as we save it, everything they're separated into 3 columns here, 1 2 3, these 3 columns, and every element is arranged accordingly inside the column, inside 3 columns. Now if I want to have 4 columns, I can give another column like 1 FR, and so our elements will be arranged in 4 columns. Even I can make one column bigger than another, so we can say 2 FR, so one column will be bigger than another if the width and height are changed a little. So just if we shrink these elements a little, you will understand. So now the first column is 1 fractional, but the second column is 2 fractional, the third column is 1 fractional, and the fourth column is 1 fractional. The same thing you can let's just change, and so on. We don't need to use fractions, even we can use something like pixels. So we can say that let's say 30 pixels, and the second column it will take only 30 pixels, and the rest will be evenly distributed in 1 fraction, 1 fraction, 1 fraction, and so on. You can use any kind of parameters here, even percentages, and it will act like it. Like I want to have a 30% column and then a 70% column in a page, so it will have a 30% column and then 70% column, and so on. And now we can do the same things for rows. Usually we don't specify the rows, but you can specify the rows, like the first row will be of 2 fractions, and the second row will be 1 fraction, and so on, and the third row will be of 3 fraction. And if we have these things like 50 pixels one again, so you can see the first row it's of 2 fraction, the second row is 1 fraction, but the third row is 3 fraction, and the fourth row happens after it. So if I just say this is also of 3 fraction, then the third row will be of 3 fraction, fourth row will be of 3 fraction, second row will be of 1 fraction, and first row will be 1 fraction. What I can do is I can open the inspector here, just quickly open the inspector here, and let's move this a little bit here so we can see everything clearly. And inside inspector, if I hover into the parent container, the grid, you can see the outlines. These are red dotted lines to represent the outlines of the grid. And like I can just, let's say I want this to 1 fraction, and then 2 fraction, and then 3 fraction. So you can clearly see the outline of the grid, that this is 1 fraction, 2 fraction, 3 fraction, and this is 1 fraction, and this is in case of the rows, this is 2 fraction, then 1 fraction, then 3 fraction, and 3 fraction. So we can create these kind of small cells where every element will acquire 1 or more cells. We will look at 1 or more cells later, and so on. Now you may wonder that every element present in this grid, and they are just aligned to the top left corner of the cell of every small cell. So what if we just want to place everything at the center or left or right, what we can do? The answer is simple. What you can do is you can just like flexbox, where we applied the arrangement to the parent container. Here we apply the arrangement to every child container, because I want the first child to be here, the second child to be so for the first child let's leave it like this, but for the second child I want it to be at bottom right. So we'll say justify self. Okay, not justify content, but justify self, because it's justifying itself, not its content. So justify content, and I will just call it just like previously, flex end. Okay, and then align self to flex end, and it will be at the bottom right corner. And if I want the third element to be exactly at center, so we'll say justify self to center and align self to center, so it will be at the center of the third grid, and so on. We can place the items in different cells using justify using justify and align self. Like here we have put it at this corner, this at this corner, this at this corner, and we can also arrange these things at different corners. And after applying these kind of properties, we can also trigger the individual properties, like if we want it, let's say the main divs, we want them to be of 100% width and 100% height. And if we do that, height 100%, they will cover the whole grid area, not the 100% of the parent. So you can see that the parent grids, they are perfectly filled. If we just say the div to or the height with the height to content 100%, and you can see how it's going, it's getting very powerful from this point. So let's keep on going with this endeavor, and let's try something good, and that is to give a little gap between these elements, like we used the justify content in case of flex, where it was a space around or space evenly. In same case, for grid, we can specify a row gap and a column gap. So we can say grid gap, grid gap, row gap, and we can give it like 10 pixel of gap between each row. So every row they will have a 10 pixel of gap here. If I now hover into a grid, you can see that between two rows there is a 10 pixel gap. The same thing we can do for columns. So we can say column gap, column gap, and we can set it to like 20 pixels. So you can see that now our grid, it has row gaps of 10 pixels and column gaps of 20 pixels, and it has a very unique kind of mosaic structure like this. And you can see how we can use this kind of this grid into designing basically any kind of complex structure, complex layout that has to be laid out in 2D, and also the elements can overlap one another. We will look into that later. But let's say we don't want the row and column gaps to be different, but they all have a even gap. So instead of row and column gap, we can use only gap, and it will have an even gap between every elements. So now let's remove this gap because we don't need this gap. But now let's look at the next and also very robust property of grid. That is, you may ask me that every item is going to have consuming one cell, but if I want an item to stretch using two cells, what can I do? And the answer is simple. We use the grid lines to lay out our element. Now if we hover into this grid again, we can see that our grid has 3 columns and 4 rows, and that leaves us with 4 lines in columns. This is the first line, then this is the second line, this is the third line, and this is the fourth line. And for rows, this is the last row line, this is the third row line, this is the second row line. There are 5 lines. Basically the number of lines is 1 plus the number of rows, or 1 plus the number of columns, because the first line represents the top and the left. Okay, and we can use these lines as the guidance to our element, that from where to where the element has to stretch. So let's look at a very practical example on this topic. That is, we want this div to stretch from, if I hover into the grid here for once, to from line from here to here. So it will stretch from column number line 2 to column number line 4. So what I can do is, for our 8th child, this one, the last child, I can say that grid column, and I want it to start from 2, where it is the second column, this second column, and reach to the end column, that is the fourth column, because there are 3 columns and this is the end column, because this is 1, this is 2, this is 3, and this line is 3 and this is 4. And also I want it, the same thing we can do for rows. So I want it at the bottom, so I can say grid row, and I want it to be stretched from the 4th line to 5th line, so 4/5. And what it will do, it will place it here and the remaining space will be emptied. Now I want this one to stretch from here at to the end of this line, this whole row, for the 7th div. Okay, the div 7. So what I will do is I will say, let's say grid row to be, the grid row will be same, I don't want to change this grid row, but I want to say the grid column to stretch from 1 to 4 to cover the entire space. Okay, and this is not call but columns here, LUMN, so it's not working. As you can see, it has now stretched the whole column. Now for this small div, this div 4, I want to take this div 4 from here and place it at the bottom of this stack. Okay, this bottom of this grid. So what I will do is I will go to the 4th element and I will say that its grid column will start from 1 and will end at 2, which it already is, but still I am specifying it. And the grid row to start from 4th line and end at 5th line, like the end element. And suddenly the element from here is placed here, and the remaining elements, they filled up the space and make this space available. So for the finale I can just push this 6th element to the fullest here. So you can say the 6th element, this 6th element, it will have a grid row of not row but column of from 2 to 4 to stretch the entire, once again I used call but column, it happens sometime. So you can see that using grid we can create a very complex structures. And also after applying these normal constraints, we can once again apply transform, like we can say transform, and I can translate this to 10 pixel at horizontal and 20 pixel at vertical, and it will be translated from its grid designated position to its new position. And so from this simple example you can see how we can use grid to create various very complex structures very easily. Okay, so now let's remove most of the elements and keep only, let's say, 5 elements. Okay, we don't need the rest of the elements, and the rest of the elements, they are just going to be deleted. So we have 5 elements, and the rest of the elements we are just going to delete them, and we are also going to delete these properties to look at one another interesting ability that grid provides us. Okay, and for now let's just remove the row portion here. I don't need the row, rather we will just be using the columns, and whenever the rows are not specified, it will assume that how many rows are going to be made by the elements, that is the count of row, and every row will have same width. The same thing goes for columns. Whenever the columns are not specified but only rows are specified, every element will be considering the same kind of thing. So I'm not going to go over it, but let's say we have a 1 fraction and a 3 fraction here, 3 fraction, and then once again, or we can have this like 3 fraction, 1 fraction. Okay, so we have something like this, and now we want to create the previous structure that we already created once again, like a small website structure here. It will have a header and a footer and so on. And what we will do is we will specify grid template areas, and here we will put some strings like header, 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 and so on. And let's say our first child, it has a grid area called header. Okay, so as you can see, it's acting as a header. Now we can design very complex layouts just by writing the areas. So let me show you. If the first element is the header, acts as header, and the second element acts as main or aside, let's say main. The third one grid area acts as the footer, and the fourth one element acts as, let's say, child sidebar, and for the fifth one let's say it acts as a pop-up, so we'll just say pop. Okay, like the bottom pop-up. So what we can do is, now we have a visual representation of how we want to lay out our pages. So I can say header, 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 and then for the next row we will have our aside. Just let me see once again. Sorry, sidebar. So sidebar, then our main content here. There are 3 rows, so we will be doing 3 by 3. Once again there will be sidebar, our main. Once again we'll have our sidebar, our main, and here we will have our pop, and then we will have our footer. And we will save it. Just change this to main, and as we can see, it's just working as perfect. Just let's put pop here. Okay, so as you can see, it's just acting the same. The elements are actually squared, so when I put pop here, it just broke it, because we cannot have a element like this. But if the elements are all thought as squares, you can see that it can easily create very complex layouts. Like for the header, we just want to say it's a very small grid area, so you can say grid area in grid template rows. It will have a 70 pixels of header, and then the rest will be dealt automatically. If we want to specify more rows, we can specify. If we don't want to specify, we don't need to specify. But you can see that grid is a very powerful container that can create a very versatile 2D layouts very easily. Okay, and last but not the least, we will look at transforms. Transforms allows us to transform the element in a 3D way into a website. So we will just work it with the main, so everything should become clear. So for transform, there are different kinds of transform. The first is translate, which translate the page to a place like 10 pixels left and 50 pixels top. We have already seen this, as this transform works. You can also translate single elements, like translate X so it will only translate at x-axis, or translate y will only translate at y-axis. We also have something like rotate, which rotates an element. So let's say rotate x, y and z. Z rotates it normally, so we will say rotate z 45 degree. So it will rotate the element like this. And we all can also scale, like we want to scale it to half of the size, so 0.5, and it will be scaled down. And you can use transform, rotate and scales accordingly to have our element shrank or have some 3D space transform. There are also some properties I just want to mention in a future video if we talk about 3D transform, which we will be dealing with. One is transform origin, which defines from which point the transform should be done. Like if I want to transform with respect to top left, the transform will be applied with respect to top left. But if we want to transform with respect to bottom right, it will be done with respect to bottom right. The same thing by normal, by default, it's the transform origin is set as center. Now if I want to go into details, it will take a lot of time to explain the transform, so I will not discuss it in this video. I'm just giving you a quick demonstration. Now you can Google it out and find out the different possibilities. There is also something called as perspective view, okay, which you can achieve using something called as origin, and it will work. It will give you a 3D perspective. You can use it for parallax scrolling and stuff like that, but that's not the motto of this video. I hope by the end of this video you have a quite deeper understanding of how you can place several elements at different places and create complex layouts using the techniques I have discussed. The last one that I want to mention is float. Float is the most simple and the basic kind of so let's just remove this first. So we can use a float as the most basic kind of layout designing. So let's say inside our div 5 we have inside our div 2, which is a big div, we have an element that is let's say add another div. Let's say we have another div, okay, and it has a class of left, and I just want to put this div to the left, not div, let's put something else. Let's say we have something as a small span, which is let's say says Pokemon, okay. So we have this span Pokemon here, and I want this is by default placed here, but I want to place it here to the right. So what I can do is I can just simply say span, and I can give it a float of, by default it's right, so float of right. By default it's left, so float right, and it will go to the right, okay. If there are some external component, some external informations like this, just 1 second, it will automatically manage its position to the right, and you don't have to think about it that much. So hopefully we have you can look into the floats. In some situations only a simple float can solve your issue, but that's it for today. I hope you have enjoyed this long video, and hope this is helpful to you. But with these basic knowledges, if you just have some little practice, you can create any kind of complex layout that you desire easily. And so yeah, if you feel that this video has helped you in your web development or designing, please hit the like button and If you have any questions, feel free to leave the comments. I will try to answer them to the best of my knowledge. Till then, bye.